In the spring of 2001, every beef farmer in Lac-Saint-Jean County, Quebec, managed their pastures the same way. You let the cattle out in May. You let them graze until October. You brought them in for winter. You spread manure in the spring, and you hoped the grass came back thick enough to carry the herd to another season. This was not a strategy. It was inheritance. The land had been grazed this way since before the roads were paved, and the men who grazed it were the sons of men who had grazed it, and the idea that any of them might do something fundamentally different with their pasture ground was not a controversial idea. It was not even an idea. It was simply not a thing that existed in Lac-Saint-Jean County in the spring of 2001. The Bouchard farms sat on 380 acres northeast of Alma, where the land flattened out along the Rivière aux Saumons watershed, and the soil was the particular dark color that meant it had once been lake bed and still remembered water. Henri Bouchard had bought the original parcel in 1974 with money he had saved over 6 years of working at the Alcan smelter in Arvida, and money he had borrowed from his father-in-law on terms that were never written down because writing them down would have been an insult to both men. He had built a herd from 12 cows to 80 over the following 20 years by doing what every serious beef farmer in the region did. He grazed hard, he supplemented with hay in dry stretches, he applied what inputs he could afford, and he did not ask whether there was another way to do things because the way he was doing things was working. His farm was not the largest operation in the county, but it was a respectable operation. Henri was a respectable man. He paid his bills on time and he showed up at the agricultural cooperative meetings, and he had an opinion about provincial subsidy programs that was consistent and clearly held. He was 58 years old in the spring of 2001, and he had been farming for 27 years, and he had made every decision on that land himself. His son-in-law, Bernard Gagnon, had married Henri's daughter Pauline in 1996 and had been working the Bouchard farm full-time since 1998. Bernard was 47 years old. He had grown up on a dairy operation outside of Chicoutimi and had spent 3 years in the early 1990s working at an agricultural research station near Saint-Hyacinthe before deciding that he would rather farm than study farming. He was a quiet man. Not shy, but deliberate. The kind of man who thought for a long time before he said something and who, when he said it, did not repeat himself. Henri had trusted him with the machinery maintenance and the hay cutting and the record keeping from the beginning, because Bernard kept accurate records and did not complain about the work. What Henri had not fully understood when he offered Bernard a permanent place on the farm was that Bernard's 3 years at the research station had filled a notebook with observations about soil and pasture management that he had been carrying in his truck for nearly a decade, waiting for the right time to say something. Let me tell you about Bernard Gagnon, because he is the reason this story exists, and he is different from most men you have heard about on this channel, not because he was smarter than his father-in-law, though he had read more. Not because he was more ambitious. He was not ambitious in the way that word usually means. He was different because he was patient, not passive. Patient. There is a difference, and it matters here. Bernard had watched the Bouchard pastures for 3 years before he said anything. He had watched the way the cattle concentrated along the creek edges and grazed those areas down to bare soil, while the far corners of the fields grew rank and coarse and were left untouched. He had watched the infiltration slow in the heavily grazed sections after rain events. He had watched the grass composition shift, year by year, away from the deep-rooted species toward the shallow-rooted plants that could tolerate constant pressure and recover fast, but held less water and built less organic matter. He had written all of this down in the notebook. He had not said anything. He was waiting for Henri to be ready. The spring of 2001 was when Bernard decided the waiting was finished. Let me tell you about the science, because you need to understand what Bernard understood before you can understand what he proposed. Pasture ground under continuous grazing, where cattle move freely across the entire acreage all season, degrades in a specific and predictable way. The animals graze the most palatable areas first, the areas near water, near shade, near the gates, and they return to those areas repeatedly because the young regrowth is sweeter than the mature grass. This selective grazing removes the plant before it has recovered its root reserves. It shortens the roots. It reduces the plant's ability to photosynthesize, to build organic matter, to hold the soil. Over years, the heavily grazed areas become compacted, low in organic matter, and dominated by stress-tolerant but nutritionally shallow species. The lightly grazed areas become overmature, rank, and unpalatable, and their nutrients cycle poorly because they are never consumed and returned to animal digestion. The whole system drifts toward a state where you are feeding the cattle more and more hay to compensate for pasture that is producing less and less. What Bernard had read about at the research station, what he had spent 3 years watching in controlled trials and written down in his notebook, was called managed rotational grazing. You divide the pasture into paddocks, anywhere from 8 to 20 depending on the operation. You move the cattle through the paddocks on a rotation that allows each section a full recovery period, typically 40 to 60 days in the growing season, before the animals return. The cattle graze intensively for a short period, 2 to 4 days, and then they move. The grass has time to rebuild its root reserves, to regrow fully, to send carbon deeper into the soil. The soil biology responds. The organic matter climbs. The water infiltration improves. In drought conditions, the managed pastures retain moisture that conventional creosote fields shed. The carrying capacity of the land, the number of animals the acreage can support, increases over time rather than declining. Bernard had watched the research station run this trial for 2 full seasons. He had the yield numbers. He had the soil test comparisons. He had it all in the notebook. He brought it up on a Thursday evening in April, after supper, when Henri was reviewing the spring pasture plan at the kitchen table. Bernard sat down across from him and set the notebook on the table and said, "I want to show you something I have been thinking about for a while." Henri looked at the notebook. He looked at his son-in-law. "What kind of something?" he said. Bernard explained it the way the researchers at St. Hyacinthe had explained it to him. The grazing pressure distribution, the root depletion cycles, the organic matter decline. He showed Henri the soil test results from the research station trials. He showed him the carrying capacity, numbers from a farm in Ontario that had converted to rotational management in 1994 and had increased their effective stocking rate by 30% over 6 years without adding fertilizer inputs. He told him that the fencing cost to divide the Bouchard pastures into 12 paddocks would run approximately $4,000 in materials, that the labor would be his own, that the system would pay for itself in reduced hay purchases within 2 to 3 seasons if the soil responded the way the research suggested it would. He told him that the creek sections were losing ground every year, that the far corners were producing grass that the cattle would not eat unless they had no other option, that the farm was running on momentum that was older than either of them, and that momentum had a direction. The kitchen was quiet. Pauline was at the sink. She did not turn around, but she had stopped moving. Henri set down his coffee. He said, "You want to put up electric fence in my pastures." 12 paddocks, Bernard said, "and a central water system so they have access in each one." Henri picked up his coffee again. "I'll think about it," he said. Pauline walked past Bernard on her way out of the kitchen and touched his shoulder once, quickly, without saying anything. Henri thought about it for 4 days. On the 5th day, he told Bernard he could fence off the back section. The 40 acres along the creek, the wet ground, the section that had always been the most degraded and the least productive, not the whole farm, the back 40. If it made a mess of the grazing rotation, they would take the fence down in the fall. Bernard said that was fair. Let me tell you about the morning in June when Bernard drove into Alma to pick up fencing supplies at the Coopérative Fédérée, because it is the moment this story tilts, and you need to understand what kind of room that was before you can understand what was said in it. The cooperative on a weekday morning in early summer was a specific kind of place. Farmers came in for parts and supplies, and they drank coffee at the counter, and they talked about the hay outlook and the coyote situation, and the price of calves at the auction in Herberville. The man who held the room most mornings was Roger Plant, who had been running the largest beef operation in the county for 30 years, and who had opinions about every agricultural decision made within 20 kilometers of Alma. Roger Plant was not a bad man. He was a certain man. He had built his operation on certainty, and he had 300 cows to show for it, and he did not see any reason to question methods that had produced 300 cows. He was 61 years old, and he had never been wrong about pasture management in Lac-Saint-Jean County. Bernard was at the counter pricing out step-in posts and polytape when Roger came in for hydraulic fluid and saw what was on the counter and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Bernard Gagnon, what are you building?" Bernard told him. The pause was about 3 seconds. Roger Plant started laughing. "Now, let me stop here and ask you something. Have you ever heard a laugh that was not really about what was funny? Not a laugh of genuine surprise or even disagreement. A laugh that is a reflex, the sound a person makes when something disrupts a certainty so deep they have never had to examine it, and the only available response is to make the person who disrupted it feel small enough to stop. That was the laugh Roger Plant produced at the Cooperative Fédéré counter on that June morning. It was a short laugh, a dismissive laugh. He'd assumed the room would join it. Some of the men did. Some of them looked at their coffee cups. "Electric fence in 12 sections, Roger said, and you are going to move the cows every 2 days. Bernard, those cattle will spend half their time standing at the next gate waiting to get in. You know what happens to a farm run by a man who read too many government reports?" He said it without looking up from the hydraulic fluid, like it was a thing already concluded. That Henri Bouchard's son-in-law was going to spend $4,000 to learn a lesson the cows already knew. Bernard asked how many pounds per acre Roger was averaging on his best pasture ground. Roger looked at him. "About what I need," he said, which was not an answer. Bernard picked up his supplies and paid and walked out. He did not argue. He drove back to the farm and he started building the fence. Let me tell you about the fencing, because the details matter. Bernard divided the back 40 into 4 paddocks to start, not the full 12 he had planned for eventually, because 4 was what he could build alone in a reasonable time, and 4 was enough to demonstrate the principle. He drove the corner posts himself over 3 weekends in June. He ran the polytape on step-in posts at a height that the Bouchard-Charolais crosses would respect. He installed a central water line with a frost-free hydrant that could supply portable troughs in each paddock so the cattle did not need creek access. The creek bank, the part that had been trampled bare for 20 years, he fenced off entirely. He seeded it with a mixture of orchard grass and all-site clover and left it alone. The first rotation took 14 days. 4 paddocks, 3 days each, 2 days rest at the gate. The cattle moved more than they were used to. There was some bawling at the paddock boundaries the first week. By the 3rd week, they moved on their own when Bernard opened the gate because they had learned that the new paddock meant fresh grass. Roger Plant drove past on the county road twice in July and did not stop. The pasture response was not dramatic that first year because pasture recovery does not work that way. What Bernard was doing was invisible to anyone driving past on the road. You could not see root depth from a truck window. You could not see organic matter percentage or water infiltration rate, or the shift in plant species composition that was beginning in the most heavily grazed areas. You could see that the cattle looked settled. You could see that the grass in the rested paddocks was growing taller than it usually grew before the animals came back. But if you were Roger Plant and you had already decided what you were going to see, you would see a man with an unnecessarily complicated fencing arrangement and cows standing at a gate. Bernard measured water infiltration in the back paddocks that fall, using the same method he had learned at the research station. A coffee tin pushed 6 inches into the soil, a measured volume of water, a stopwatch. The conventionally grazed sections of the Bouchard farm absorbed water at 0.6 inches per hour. The back 40, after 1 season of rotational management, absorbed at 1.1 inches per hour. He wrote that in the notebook. He showed it to Henri at supper. Henri looked at the numbers for a moment and said, 1 season? 1 season, Bernard agreed, but the direction is right. Henri thought about it. Then he said, "You can do the north field too." The north field was 80 acres. Bernard had doubled his trial. Let me tell you about the summer of 2002 and what it did to every beef operation in Lac-Saint-Jean County. The drought of 2002 was not the kind of drought that makes the national news because it came on slowly, and it came on in the wrong province for national coverage, and it came on during a summer when there were other things to talk about. But in the county northeast of Alma, the farmers felt it the way they felt everything, in the grass and in the animals and in the numbers at the feed store. Rainfall from May through August came in at 60% of normal. The shallow-rooted pastures, the continuous grazed fields that had been losing organic matter for years, went into stress in early July. The grass stopped growing. What was there was grazed down to nothing and did not come back. By the third week of July, Roger Plant was cutting into his second cut hay reserve to keep his herd fed. He was not alone. The cooperative was selling hay at prices that made every farmer in the county recalculate their winter projections. The Bouchard Back 40 and Northfield were not doing well. Let me be clear about that. 2002 was not a good year for anyone running cattle in Lac-Saint-Jean. But they were doing differently. The infiltration rate that Bernard had measured, 1.1 inches per hour in the managed section versus 0.6 in the conventional ground, meant that every rain event was being captured and held rather than running off the compacted surface. The organic matter in the back 40, which had climbed from 2.4% to 3.1% over 2 seasons, was holding that moisture in the root zone. The deep-rooted species, the orchard grass and the all-site clover that Bernard had seeded along the creek bank, were reaching water that the shallow-rooted stressed plants in the county's conventional pastures could not reach. The cattle on the rotational system grazed a paddock and moved. The rested paddocks had time to pull whatever moisture remained in the subsoil and put up a flush of growth before the animals returned. It was not abundant. It was enough. Bernard supplemented with hay from the second week of August, 3 weeks later than the county average began supplementing. His hay bill for the 2002 season was 40% lower than it would have been at the previous year's consumption rate. He calculated the savings on a separate page in the notebook and showed it to Henri on a Tuesday evening when the drought had finally broken in September and the grass was just beginning to come back. Henri sat at the table with his green ledger book open on one side and Bernard's spiral notebook open on the other. He looked at the numbers for a long time. He was a man who had made every decision on that farm himself for 27 years. He was looking at 2 years of evidence written in his son-in-law's handwriting that said the ground was capable of something he had not asked it to do, and that it had taken half a century of unexamined grazing to get it to where it was, and that the direction had changed. He said, "You were right." He did not say it loudly. He said it the way a man says something that has been waiting to be said for a while. "You were right, and I gave you the back 40, like it was a test I expected you to fail." Bernard said, "The back 40 is why we have 2 years of data." Henri looked at him. "I know," he said. "That is not what I mean." Pauline was in the doorway between the kitchen and the hallway. She did not say anything. She was not smiling exactly. She was doing something quieter than smiling. Let me tell you about the October afternoon when Roger Plant turned into the Bouchard driveway, because that is the moment this story has been moving toward since that June morning at the cooperative. He came alone in his truck, and he parked by the machine shed and found Bernard checking the water line on the portable trough system before the freeze. He stood at the edge of the paddock, and he had the look of a man who has driven somewhere he did not expect to drive, and is not entirely decided what to say when he gets there. "Bernard," he said, "you got a few minutes?" Bernard straightened up. "Sure, Roger." Roger came in and stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the paddock layout and the cattle settled in the far section and the grass height in the 2 rested paddocks. He looked at all of it for a moment without speaking. "I had a bad summer," he said. Bernard did not say anything. "I know you had a better one. I talked to Henri at the auction and he told me your hay numbers." Roger paused. I have 3 guys I know who are thinking about changes after this year, and they keep asking me what to tell them, and I don't." He stopped. He tried again. "I was wondering if you would be willing to walk me through what you did. The fencing setup, the rotation schedule, the water system, what it costs, what it takes." Bernard set down his tools. He looked at Roger Plant for a moment. Then he said something he had not planned to say, something that had been sitting in him since that June morning at the counter. "Roger," he said, "do you remember what you said to me at the cooperative in June of last year when you saw the fencing supplies?" Roger had the decency to be uncomfortable. "I remember," he said. "You said the farm was being run by a man who read too many government reports." Bernard said it without heat, the way you read back something that was written down. "I was standing at a counter with $4,000 of my father-in-law's money that I had convinced him to spend, and you told the room I was going to teach the cows a lesson they already knew." Roger looked at the cattle. "I am not telling you that to make you feel bad," Bernard said. "I am telling you because the lesson is not that rotational grazing is magic. The lesson is that a pasture grazed the same way every year for 50 years will drift toward a state that looks like normal, and is not. It will look like this is just what the land produces, and the drought will come and the land will tell you what it actually had left. This summer was that drought for a lot of operations in this county, and it did not have to be." He picked up his tools. "Come out this weekend and I will walk you through the whole system," he said. "Bring your 3 people." Roger nodded. He said, "I appreciate that." He stood there a moment longer with his hat in his hands, turning it, and then he put it on and walked back to his truck. Let me tell you about what happened in the years that followed, because the story does not close in October. By 2004, 9 farms in the county had adopted some version of the rotational system that Bernard had developed on the Bouchard ground. By 2007, that number was 19. The results were not identical across every operation because rotational grazing is not a formula you apply, it is a practice you develop, and it requires observation and adjustment, and the willingness to let the land show you what it needs, rather than telling it what you expect. But the trend was consistent. Hay bills were declining. Carrying capacity was holding in dry years when the conventional operations were cutting herd numbers. The creek banks that had been bare and eroding were growing back. The farmers who had been in the system for 3 or 4 seasons were running soil tests and showing them to their neighbors. Henri Bouchard retired from active farming in 2006. He did not leave the farm. He was there every morning and he walked the paddocks with Bernard on weekends, and he had opinions about the cattle, which were still good opinions. But the decisions were Bernard's, and Henri did not second-guess them, and the 2 of them had arrived at a way of working together that was different from the first years and better. In 2008, Bernard was invited to present at the Union des Producteurs Agricoles regional conference in Roberval. He was 54 years old. He stood at a podium in a room with 300 farmers and extension agents and cooperative representatives, and he showed them 7 years of soil test data and hay consumption records and carrying capacity numbers from the Bouchard farm. He showed them the infiltration rates, the organic matter curves, the comparison data from the 2002 drought season. He explained the biology the way the researchers at St. Hyacinthe had explained it to him. And at the end he said what he had said to Roger Plant in the paddock, that a pasture grazed the same way for 50 years will produce a normal that is not what the land is capable of, and that the drought does not create the problem, it only reveals the one that was already there, and that the land will recover if you learn to move with it instead of standing on it. Henri Bouchard was in the 4th row. He was 65 years old, and he had not been to a regional conference in 11 years. When Bernard finished, Henri stood up. He was not the kind of man who stood up at things. He stood up slowly, the way a man stands when he has decided something. 2 people near him looked over, then stood. Then a section of the room was standing, and Bernard looked out from the podium at his father-in-law in the 4th row, standing with his arms at his sides, not applauding dramatically, just standing, and he understood exactly what that meant, because he had known Henri Bouchard for 12 years. Let me tell you about one last thing because it is the part that carries furthest. In the spring of 2017, Bernard's daughter Isabelle was 22 years old and finishing her final year in agricultural science at Université Laval in Quebec City. She had grown up helping on the Bouchard farm since she could walk the paddock wires. The rotational system was simply how the farm worked. The way continuous grazing had once been simply how every farm in the county worked, not a decision, a fact. That spring, Isabelle came home for the Easter break with a printed paper she had found in a peer-reviewed journal about a mixed-species cover cropping system being trialed on beef operations in Manitoba, cattle integration with annual forages, planned periods of soil rest with no animals at all, a managed organic matter building cycle that made what the Bouchard farm had been doing since 2001 look, in her words, like a first chapter. She put the paper on the kitchen table and said, "I want to try something on the South Quarter." Bernard looked at the paper. He looked at his daughter. He did not say he would think about it. He did not offer her the back 40. He said, "How much time do you need before you know whether it is working?" 3 seasons, she said. "All right," he said, "let me know what fencing you need." The notebook is in the truck. Not a spiral-bound college notebook, a proper field notebook with a waterproof cover that Bernard bought in 2003 when the original had filled up. Isabelle has her own one now, the same kind bought at the same store in Alma. Both of them are in the truck. Roger Plant sold his operation in 2012 and moved to Saguenay. Before he left, he drove out to the Bouchard farm one last time and stood at the gate of the original back 40. And looked at the creek bank that had been bare soil in 2001 and was now a thick stand of orchard grass and alder that the cattle had not touched in 11 years. He said, "I should have asked more questions sooner." Bernard told him that the 9 farmers he had sent to the farm in 2003 had learned the system in time for the dry years of 2005 and 2010, and that their land was in better shape for it. Roger seemed to find some comfort in that. The Bouchard farm is still there, northeast of Alma, 380 acres along the watershed. The organic matter in the managed pastures now averages 4.2%, a number the regional NRCS office points to when extension agents are explaining to new farmers what the soil is capable of when given time. The hay bills that Henri Bouchard was paying in 2001 have been reduced by more than half. The carrying capacity of the land has increased by 22% without an acre of new ground added. The creek bank that was bare in June of 2001 when Bernard started building fence is dense with grass and it has not eroded since 2004. Bernard Gagnon still farms it. He is 70 years old. He moves the cattle on the same rotation he started in 2001, adjusted now by field and season and rainfall, and the particular way each paddock responds in a dry July versus a wet one. He reads the land the way the land asks to be read, which is slowly and with attention, and without assuming that what it did last year is the only thing it knows how to do. He divided the pasture. They laughed. The drought came. The grass died. The rotated ground lived. I think about Bernard standing at that cooperative counter with $4,000 worth of fencing supplies, and Roger Plant's laugh still in the room. He picked up his order and walked out. He did not argue. He did not explain himself the second time. He just drove back to the farm and built the fence. That is the part I come back to, not the drought numbers, not the infiltration rates, the walking out. Because the easiest thing in that moment would have been to doubt. To look at a man with 30 years and 300 cows behind his opinion and think maybe he sees something I don't. Bernard had every reason to fold. He was the son-in-law. He was the one who had read the reports. He was not even the one whose name was on the land. And the room had laughed with Roger, not at him, which is the particular kind of laugh that finds the cracks in a person and works its way in. What kept Bernard moving was not stubbornness. I want to be clear about that. Stubbornness is just pride wearing work gloves. What Bernard had was something quieter and harder to build. He had done the reading. He had run the measurements at St. Hyacinthe and written them down and sat with them for years before he said a word to Henri. When Roger laughed, Bernard already knew what the infiltration numbers said. He already knew what the root depth studies showed. The laugh could not change the data. And because he had done the work of actually understanding what he was proposing, he could not be argued out of it by a man who had not. That kind of clarity, the kind that comes from genuine knowledge rather than opinion, is one of the things I think we undervalue. We call it confidence, which makes it sound like a personality trait, something you either have or you don't. But Bernard was not a confident man in the usual sense. He was a careful man. He earned his position not by asserting it, but by earning the right to hold it, quietly, over years. There is a difference, and the drought of 2002 revealed it. And then there is what he did when Roger came to the paddock gate in October. He could have said nothing. He could have just walked the man through the fencing layout and sent him home. He had earned that silence. Instead, he said the harder thing, that the problem was not the drought, it was what the land had been silently losing for 50 years, and that a lot of people in the county had paid for that, and a summer they didn't have to lose. He said it without cruelty. He said it because Roger's 3 neighbors needed to hear it too, and Roger was the only one who could carry it back to them. That is the choice I find most worth thinking about, not the fencing decision, the decision to remain fair to a man who had not been fair to you, because the work matters more than the score. I don't know if Bernard thought of it that way. He probably didn't. He probably just picked up his tools and said, "Come out Saturday." But the effect was the same. 9 farms in 2004, 19 by 2007. A creek bank that grew back. An extension office using his soil tests as a reference case. Isabel with her own waterproof notebook and her own truck. The fence Bernard built in 2001 is still standing. The grass on the other side of it is still growing back.